Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Radhika Desai, a professor at the Department of Political Studies and the director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. Currently, she is a visiting professor at the Department of International Development at the London School of Economics, and she is a convener of the International Manifesto Group. Radhika has proposed a historical materialist approach to understanding world affairs in her Geopolitical Economy after U.S. hegemony, globalization, and empire, and she has worked on an original framework for understanding party politics in India in the context of its evolving political economy and social transformations in various writings. Radhika has also published a dozen books, over 100 articles, and book chapters on UK, Indian, US, and European politics, as well as on international political economy, many of which have been translated into Chinese, French, German, Turkish, and Spanish. She is a regular opinion contributor to CGTN, Counterpunch, Frontline, The Guardian, The Hindu, RT, and the Valdai Discussion Club. She hosts a fortnightly show, Geopolitical Economy Hour, on the Geopolitical Economy Report website. Her most recent book is Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, A Geopolitical Economy. I welcome Radhika Desai to Savage Minds. Radhika, I'm very familiar with your work, and we are almost separated at birth, and so much of what you've been discussing, what I've been discussing, and I find it very troubling that right now we're talking after, I think, 12 days of US, what they're calling a war, what I think for Iranians would be experienced as terrorism. And we're seeing the late stages of capitalism. You talk about this era, in fact, as the senile or moribund phase of capitalism. Could you discuss the primary symptoms of this decay in terms of what U.S. actions have been enacting upon Nicolas Maduro, Celia Flores, pirating a boat in the North Atlantic just 3 days after that, then ramping up the talk of bombing Iran just a few days after that? This all happened within 7 days. And then here we are a few weeks later with a full-on, what again the U.S. is calling war. War has not been declared by Congress, I don't believe, since the Korean War. And we're living in this very bizarre phase of watching a sitting U.S. president and his cronies go after booty, whether it's oil or control of, or who can deal with and deliver aid to, or petroleum to Cuba. And we're watching the U.S. spin out of control.
Basically, what are the principal symptoms of the senility of capitalism? I think that is the main thing. And I would say, I'm going to begin with the economic symptoms and then go on to the other ones. From the point of view of the health of capitalism itself, what the chief symptoms that you are seeing of the senility of capitalism are the, well, let me start again. One of the principal reasons that I call capitalism senile is based on an understanding of Marx's. Marx says somewhere that when capitalism arrives at the monopoly phase, it will become ripe for socialism. And the reason for that is that it will have lost what dynamism it has. And this transition to the monopoly phase had already occurred in the early 20th century. So, in a certain sense, since that time, what we are paying the cost. Humanity is paying the cost of keeping Western countries capitalist. This idea of Marx's was rejected by people on the grounds that after the Second World War, we seem to have a miraculous rejuvenation of capitalism. However, people forget that this rejuvenation took place in a context where capitalism was heavily reformed. And of course, in the post-war context, there was also a lot of wiping out of capital, so it had to be replaced, etc., etc. So So you have this, in a certain sense, the crisis of capitalism arrived as if on cue in the early 20th century with the outbreak of the First World War, the Great Depression, the continuation of imperialist war in the form of Second World War. But after that, you seem to have this so called golden age. And my point is that the golden age was of growth, of world growth, was due on the one hand to the heavily reformed condition of capitalism in the few decades after the First World War. The existence of communism and communist economies also grew robustly, and the creation in the post Second World War period of a set of institutions of international economic governance, the Bretton Woods institutions, which permitted those developing countries that were willing and able to undertake projects of autonomous national development, which inevitably leaned to the left, and experienced considerable growth, industrialization, and so on. It is on. So in that sense, that was an exceptional period. But the decline of capitalism resumes with the onset of neoliberalism. Most people think that neoliberalism is about free markets and competition and so on. In reality, neoliberalism is about allowing capital, particularly big corporate capital, to do whatever it likes, to tax it as little as possible, to give it as many subsidies and privileges as possible, to regulate it as little as possible, and so on. And this is exactly what we have seen. So, what has advanced under the covering fire of rhetoric of free markets and competition and so on is actually monopoly. Okay, so to me, to understand the senility of capitalism, the the fact that we are in a monopoly phase, that we have been in this monopoly phase, which we should have essentially brought to an end with some kind of transformation towards socialism a long time ago, this is precisely what ails capitalism. Now, in addition, so what are some of the other characteristics which emerge from this fundamentally monopoly and senile character of capitalism? Is that capitalism in its homelands, in its imperialist homelands, has deindustrialized quite massively, particularly in the leading capitalist states, the UK and the US. And along with the deindustrialization has come financialization. So, financialization essentially has led, on the one hand, to a massive expansion of debt, so that essentially any entity, whether it is a government or a household or a small company, a small enterprise, is heavily indebted. All these entities are heavily indebted, and the chief beneficiaries are, of course, the financial institutions, banks, etc., etc. On the one hand, you have a vast expansion of debt, and debt has gone through the roof by any measure, and for all these entities. And on the other hand, you have a massive expansion of speculative activity. So on the one hand, you have debt because essentially financial capital lives on skimming off part of the income, as much as possible of the income of the productive parts of the economy. So that's what it's doing. On the other hand, it does not invest this money productively. So instead of productive investment, what you get is speculative bubbles. It's almost like a kind of, you'll appreciate this particularly, it's a kind of necromancy. What do I mean by that? If the money was invested productively, then it would give rise to an expansion of productive activity, which produces the goods and services that you and I would need to continue to exist from week to week, from year to year, etc., etc. And this would employ living labor. It would employ you and me to produce all the things we would need to produce, etc. Instead, by chasing assets which essentially are already produced goods and services, which embody dead labor, this pursuit of assets, already existing assets, in the place of creating new goods and services, this is what I call necromancy. So you get this financialization and necromancy, and you get deindustrialization. And I think everybody knows what I mean by that. The share of manufacturing in it's not just that the share of manufacturing is decreasing. To some extent, you can easily imagine a situation in which, even though your manufacturing sector is robust, over time its share will be reduced, just as over time the share of agriculture has been reduced without necessarily reducing the robustness, productivity, etc. of agriculture. So that's not the main point. The point is that there is not enough productive capacity in the Western countries, chiefly because, you know, uh, contrary to the noise that is made about how innovative capitalism is and how wonderful it is at increasing productivity and so on, in reality, capitalism is no longer making profits by improving productivity. It's rather reliant on making profits by employing ever cheaper labor. And in the pursuit of employing ever cheaper labor, it is not even engaged in direct investment in foreign countries. It is simply contracting with enterprises who are making their own investment in foreign countries to buy various goods and services. So that is the kind of economic part of it, which is that basically you are seeing it. I mean, at the end of the day, as I like to say, I don't know whether people will get it, but what's the use value of a capitalist? Why do we tolerate capitalists? We tolerate capitalists in the expectation that that they will create employment, but they're not even doing that. So why are we putting up with them? Essentially, we are looking at a capitalism that is basically kaput. Investment is bumping along the bottom in all Western countries. So that's the economic situation. Now, of course, there are many other dimensions of this crisis. Socially, there is a huge, I mean, society is riven with divisions, and the most fundamental underlying division is, of course, the skyrocketing inequality that we are experiencing. Inequality is, I mean, through the roof, higher than at any point in human history, according to many measures. And of course, all this does is it restricts demand further, and it puts more and more money into the hands of those who refuse to invest it productively. So essentially, in the wrong hands, from any conception of a healthy economy point of view. So there is social division. And of course, on top of this fundamental economic inequality, you can add all sorts of other divisions, because, humanity does not come in one uniform color. So once you get inequality, then inevitably those groups that are disadvantaged, whether you are non-white or you are a woman, etc., you will be disproportionately holding the wrong end of the inequality stick. You will be disproportionately poorer, you will be disproportionately employed in less good jobs, etc., etc. And so those divisions have also increased. On top of that, then you get political polarization. So that's what we are witnessing. Unfortunately, I mean, ideally, a political polarization should be welcome, because, basically you've got the capitalists versus the rest. Unfortunately, it's not the left that is organizing the rest, the discontents of capitalism, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it. I mean, in my view, no other kind of capitalism is possible except this kind of neoliberal capitalism today. So it doesn't matter whether you call it capitalism or neoliberalism. But the point is that the discontents are unfortunately being mobilized, or at least a substantial part of them are being mobilized by the right, by the likes of Trump and the Alternative für Deutschland and the etc. etc. So you have this very, very dangerous situation politically. And finally, I would say that and in political terms, I would also say that there is another manifestation of the senility of capitalism, and that is manifest in the absolute precipitous decline in the quality of leadership in capitalist countries. So you get jokers like Boris Johnson or Liz Truss or Donald Trump. I mean, even Joe Biden. I mean, this decline has been, basically coterminous with the neoliberal era. In a certain sense, we used to make fun of Ronald Reagan, when he was president, for being a B movie actor, and what did he understand and so on. But if you look at the leaders of today, I mean, he comes out as, I mean, having at least a few convictions. Ditto Thatcher. But after that, you see a straightforward decline. You see charlatans of every variety, and I'm now talking about both sides of the political spectrum, of the very narrow political spectrum that now exists in Western countries. So I would say that people like Blair were as much charlatans as were people like Boris Johnson, and so on. So these people, they no longer, our politicians no longer have any vision they want to realize for their country. For them, political office is just one more box to tick in a CV, in which you are going to go through the revolving door, in which you will be, in politics today, in the media tomorrow, in business the next day, and so on. In all, and at the top of, at the kind of a circulation of elites at the top, none of whom take any responsibility for their actions, none of whom have any vision, etc. And so this is what we are seeing. So that's the political side. And finally, I would say that, alongside this kind of mollycoddling of monopolies, we have seen a massive cultural degeneration. Right now we are seeing in different countries, people are talking about, restricting access of children to social media and so on. But basically, essentially what has happened is we have allowed these platform monopolies to be publishers without taking the responsibility of being publishers. And it's ironic because, we are going to post this on some kind of social media, but that's the way it is. Because they have taken over, the place of the media. So anyway, so we are looking at a level of cultural degeneration, with decreasing intellectual capacities. One of my favorite jokes about artificial intelligence is, one guy says to another guy, "Are you worried about the rise of artificial intelligence?" And this guy answers, he says, "No, but I am worried about the decline of natural intelligence." So, I mean, this is the situation we are in. Kids are growing up today, going through school without really reading a single book from cover to cover. And what does that tell you, about the kind of thinking that we will have from now on, both at the level of, I mean, and thinking is required for everything from the most menial work to the top level political leadership of any country. So all on all of these fronts we are experiencing. And, oh, I should add a couple of other things. In fact, you mentioned wars. uh, so, politically as well, rising public debt is another symptom of that, because we have a political leadership that, on the one hand, is committed to not taxing the rich, and on the other hand, has maxed out how much it can tax ordinary people. Right. So we have an enormous fiscal crisis that, here in England, for example, this is very manifest because Rachel Reeves, the hapless Chancellor of the Exchequer or Finance Minister that we have, she is literally caught. She refuses to tax rich people, except, at the margins, tiny little bits, just to make a big show of it than anything else. And on the other hand, she keeps imposing new taxes or levies on ordinary people and having to withdraw them because, quite frankly, you can't. I mean, these people have a very big majority, but I have never seen a government with such a big majority being so electorally precarious, and they know that. So the number of U-turns this government has had to do on exactly this issue, they cut fuel subsidies for poor people, and then they had to do a U-turn. And there are similar U-turns on a whole number of counts. I mean, this is a U-turn government, and because they need a way out, and they are searching the way for a way out at the expense of the very working people who have voted them into office. So this is the bind they are in. So politically, there's also that. There's the decline of leadership, and then I was going to say that there is also ecological destruction. People say that we are living in the Anthropocene. Somehow that just being human means that we have this antagonistic relationship with the environment. This is simply not the case. Even capitalism, I would say, did not have such an antagonistic relationship with the environment. What you see instead, if you look at any index of environmental destruction, whether it is climate change or pollution or biodiversity loss or what have you, you will see that the index is rising, through the 20th century, but it really goes up much more steeply after about 1980, and that's the neoliberal era. So neoliberalism has also basically, by reducing regulation, precisely when it should have been increased, it has increased the corporations, increase the freedom with which corporations can rape and plunder nature. And it has also left more and more people so destitute that very often they have no choice but to live in ways that are heavily taxing on the environment. So from both sides, it is being squeezed. And then finally, you were mentioning wars. You were mentioning Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, and what have you. I mean, what can I say? I once gave a talk. I was really attacked by all the Americans who were there. I once gave a talk in which I said that capitalism generates wars. I mean, to me, it's a complete no-brainer. I mean, the capitalist era was characterized initially by a sort of wars against poorly armed natives of hapless territories, which the European world took over as colonies, and these people were easily defeated because, the Europeans arrived with industrially manufactured firearms, and often they were faced with no more than bows and arrows and spears and so on. So, or certainly much less well armed armies. So it was easy for them. But once, as Lenin said, the world, by 1914, the entire world was divided up among all the major European powers. At that point, the way he looked at the First World War and the 30 Years crisis that ensued after 1914, he said that, the division of the world is now complete. So now, if any power wants more territory, it can only get it by violent redivision. And that the First World War was a war of violent redivision. So the wars are, so capitalism has been, and after the end of the Second World War, which, by the way, the First World War didn't really end because it eventually it issued into a Second World War. And the Second World War was, to some, in an important way, brought to an end, not because somehow the capitalist countries were suddenly possessed of great wisdom and ability to act more sagely. On the contrary, it was possible because communist forces contributed to ending it. The contribution of the Soviet Union in the defeat of Nazi Germany, and and the Allied victory in Europe, and the contribution of Chinese communist forces in the Allied victory in the Pacific, were absolutely critical. And without them, we would not have had the end of the Second World War and the successful defeat of fascism. Um, so sorry, yeah, I'm going on, but I just express one more thought. Wars have not ended after that, though, because the imperialist impulse, even though it now faced greater obstacles in the form of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc and China and so on, it has continued to try to subjugate the rest of the world. These are the wars we are seeing right now. They are getting ever more desperate because the ability of the West to subjugate the rest of the world is declining. But the West has no plan B, so we will continue to see wars until the West is exhausted.
Yes, that seems to be the case with what is happening with Iran. I'd like to talk a bit about, at this point, not just what neoliberalism means in terms of economics, but neoliberalism has seeped through our culture in the West. And I'm thinking specifically of identity politics. Identity politics has harmed the left as well, because as you're well aware, it didn't just emerge with Democrats. Many people on the hard left embrace this stuff. I was really shocked at the beginning of it all when I became aware that there was a full on war of sorts against women, forcing women in this world of pronoun badges, in this world of let's not talk about housing, jobs, taxation, education. Let's talk about pronouns. Let's no platform that feminist over there because she refuses to XYZ. You know the story. But this has been an ongoing problem. I remember when I first started living in London around 2012, I started hearing a lot about these kinds of divisions. And I was alarmed. I was alarmed both because I was invited to teach at NYU back in the mid 90s a course
Mm-hmm.
on cultural divisions, on this kind of Said versus Huntington approach to history. I readily accepted the offer, went back to New York. I'd been doing field work in Morocco at the time, and I was a bit horrified to see that what was then the burgeoning queer theory, and I'm talking about early queer theory that was about liberating the silence cast upon people in the lesbian and gay community, that men are no longer dying of AIDS, so we can talk about sexuality in a way that's not uniquely linked to the moribund or the single gay man survivor or something like that, that became part of the imaginary of the gay lifestyle. And this all got converted culturally within the States and Canada. We saw more and more tolerance and then acceptance, and it moved from tolerating to accepting to then it wasn't even with same sex marriage, but things by the late 90s seemed to be in an interesting place, I'd say, in both countries. But suddenly I found myself being questioned in Soho. Are you aware of what's going on? And I was really shocked. I wrote a piece. I wrote other pieces about it. I've spent a decade writing about that nonsense. But I think that this did great harm to those on the left who were working towards anti capitalist progress, working towards dialogues, working towards work on the geopolitical economy itself. And instead, we had a lot of fellow leftists saying, "You're a transphobe,"
Mm.
and dealing with stuff that was like glitter. It didn't matter. It was actually against historical materialism because all of that nonsense has nothing to do with lived reality. So I'm wondering, from your position of someone who's been steeped in discussing Marxism, you've become most definitely a go to person, not just in Canada, but internationally, in terms of discussing your work on the geopolitical economy. Could you talk a bit about this, what I call the circus sidecar? This is what I think the gender wars brought us. This is what a lot of DEI brought us in terms of this over focus on things that I think were actually produced by the same neoliberal class. Because I'm thinking of Adolf Reed and many others who've worked on the professional managerial class. We've issued into our corridors, be it in business, private and public government, also academia, this idea that now everything is to be surveyed. I mean, it was hyper panopticon time for the last 2 decades.
Mm.
And so I'm wondering if you could talk about this link between the neoliberal model as an economic strategy, but also neoliberalism, what I call cultural neoliberalism, in terms of this kind of embrace of the easy go tos like pronouns, not housing, not jobs. Let's just get a pronoun. I mean, what politician like Elizabeth Warren doesn't love that stuff? She was all about her pronouns, but she couldn't actually talk about anything related to the working class these past 8 years.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much to say about about what the phenomenon that you're talking about, and indeed, it has been exceedingly destructive. I would say on the left. Let me just share with you, and I mean, I've thought a lot about this, but I'm not sure that what I have is the definitive theory, but at least I think it goes a long way anyway to understanding it. So first of all, I would say that one of the two or three key ways of understanding what's going on here. So the first one is that you just called it neoliberalism. I kind of tend to call it neoliberalism combined with social liberalism. Now, what do I mean by that? So essentially, neoliberalism is about attacking working people. giving, engaging in what I call a miserly and punitive politics towards working people. So it's miserly in the sense that it doesn't give them anything, no good wages, no good services, etc., etc. And it is punitive in the sense that if it objects, then it is subject to repression. Whether we talk about the miners' strike here in London, or any other such thing. Okay, so it's miserly and punitive politics towards the working class. But at the same time, then an appearance of progressivism is created by saying that that these other divisions, gender, race, sexual identity, sexual orientation, these things have, we are very open to diversity and all of that. So you marry, so in a and there's a very interesting example that has stuck in my mind over all these years about it. So, many years ago, I think it was in the early 90s or mid 90s, perhaps, um, mid to late 90s, there was a very important case in Canada where the surviving member of this gay couple sued the government for not giving him a pension on the grounds of equal rights for gay people. And Canada has a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and sexual orientation is part of non-discrimination grounds, and so on. So this was called the Egan and Nesbitt case. And so in its judgment, this went all the way to the Supreme Court. In its judgment, the Supreme Court said that the Supreme Court granted that this person, I forget whether it was Egan or Nesbitt, but whoever, the surviving member of the couple, was entitled on the grounds of equality to a pension from the state. But they said that they were not going to actually grant the pension because that would cost too much. Now, I ask you, since when did anybody ask the Supreme Court how much the government should spend? How much the government should spend is a function of the legislature. Let Parliament decide. And they should have granted the pension. If Parliament then wants to enact new legislation, either granting or forbidding the pension to gay survivors, let them do that. Anyway, so just to give you an idea that so they grant this what's the word for it? Like, they rhetorically, or in terms of the surface appearance, they grant the equality, but not when it comes to actually giving any serious benefits to anybody. So to me, what happened is that, with Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and so on, you got the right of the political spectrum moving further to the right. Now, for a while, it looked in the 1970s as though the left might move further to the left in reaction. But after many battles throughout the 1980s, what you saw in the 1990s is that the left also moved to the right by accepting neoliberalism, and then sort of, retaining a patina of progressivism by indulging in this kind of diversity, inclusion, etc., related social liberalism. So that's one way I understand it. The second way I understand it is that actually corporations have needed some version of social liberalism. Why? Because in the West, particularly with declining birth rates, particularly with women joining the labor force, particularly with the need for more and more immigrants at every level of employment, you have to create some kind of a discourse where the workforce is able to work together in some minimal fashion. Now, this is not to say that corporations actually care about the rights of women and working people. The statistics of regarding discrimination, regarding gender pay gaps and race pay gaps and so on, tell a completely different story. But corporations must engage in this kind of rhetoric in order to at least have the appearance of treating everybody equally, because otherwise, not even creating that appearance would mean that they may not get the workforce that they need. So, in that sense, there is that. Now, in this context, you mentioned the professional managerial class. I forget, you mentioned some thinker in relation to which you
Adolf
mentioned
Reed.
this, but Adolf Reed, right. So the professional managerial class here is very much part of this, because the professional managerial class is basically the class that has to administer this hypocritical diversity regime, where you engage in all the rhetoric of diversity, but you never grant anything, any material thing, which is why you have all this rhetoric about, equality and inclusion and so on. But actually, the actual condition of women or non-white people, etc., is actually as bad as, if not worse than what it was 30, 40 years ago, before this rhetoric really got going. So that's the second thing I would say. And then I would just like to say a final thing, the thing that I think about when I think about these things. So, somehow the liberal rhetoric of our time has, it has made everybody into kind of an armchair judge of the historical actions of other peoples. So, for example, you can say, China is bad because it is oppressing minorities in Xinjiang without ever having been there, without knowing anything about what's going on, etc. So, this diversity, equality, inclusion puts you on a higher horse in a certain sense, morally speaking. Or Iran is bad because look at, all the women have to wear chadors and so on. So this kind of completely ahistorical thinking, instead of saying, what was the condition of women in Iran under the Shah, the vast majority of women in Iran under the Shah, and what it is today, the difference is night and day. Today, there are more women who are educated, there are more women who are employed, there are more women who are in university, there are more women in Iran in fact, Iran's fertility rates today compare to most European countries. If it were the case that these women were being kept home barefoot and pregnant, then this is not evident in the statistics. So you see, so to me, this kind of what I also call finger wagging politics, quite frankly, even if it were the case that, say, a given country was, not particularly progressive on this or that issue, they're not going to get progressive by you wagging the finger at them. They might even just get more dug in. Instead, what you need to do is you need to create the material conditions under which progressive change takes place. Let me give you an example that I love citing, and I recently cited in another context. Many years ago, because I like handicrafts, I ended up in a little village in Kutch where they apparently wove very beautiful shawls, and uh, I was invited into the weaver's family, given tea, and when they, in India, as you may have experienced yourself since you spent a lot of time there, when they see a woman, like a sophisticated modern woman, even if she were dressed in a sari, it doesn't matter. They can sense who you are, and so they always want to tell you about how well the women in their families and communities are doing. And so this guy proceeds to tell me that, at the recent caste council we had, we decided that um, our girls will be educated past school. We will educate them through to university. And I said, wow, that's amazing. That's really great. I said, what brought that on? Why did you make this decision? And he said, well, now our boys are going, they're no longer doing this ancestral work that we do. They are going to cities, they are getting employment. And these days it is impossible for a family to survive in a city without the woman also working. So, they have to be educated so that they can get good jobs, when the wives go out to work along with the husbands and so on. So you see, the material circumstances of this family, this community has changed. And with the change in material circumstances, they are going to change their lifestyles, they are going to change their life decisions. This is how secularization happens, not because somebody wags their tail, wags their sorry wags their tail, you heard my dog, wags their finger at them and says, oh, you should not be doing this, etc., etc. And of course, in the neoliberal context, such material improvement is being denied to so many people. Anyway, I mean, material change of other sorts can also bring it about, but I just thought I would narrate that. So these are the ways in which, so the social democracy and moving to the right, and then needing the patina of progressivism, the element of immigration and the necessity, immigration, women's participation in the labor force, and the necessity of at least a hypocritical form of DEI, and then this role of the professional managerial class in administering this hypocritical regime, and then finally this thing about the moral high, getting on a moral high horse. These are all parts of the scene.
Yes. In fact, when you mention some of the information on Iran, it would interest, I think, our listeners, especially the feminists in the audience, to hear that in Iran, women account for approximately 56 to 63% of all university students, higher than in the US, which is 56 to 58%.
Yes.
Iran has one of the highest ratios of women in STEM, where nearly 70% of STEM graduates are female in Iran, in contrast with the US, which is 53%. PhD programs. Approximately 58% of students in Iranian professional doctoral programs are women, compared to 56% in the US. Physicians. In Iran, half of all physicians are women, 50%, and 40% of specialists are women. In the
Yeah.
US, oh my, women only represent 37% of total active physicians in the workforce.
Mhm.
I mean, there's a lot to say about some of the hokum that I've been treated to on social media by these feminists who claim, again, they obsess over the chador. And I say to them, well, if that is your bar, then where were you? Where were you about our best friends in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia? Where, I mean, if you're really about women's rights, and this is something that bothers me even where I live here in Italy, all the Italians on their websites, it's like an obsession with Iran. And I'm thinking, what is wrong with you? During lockdown, we were treated, women in Italy were treated as de facto multipliers of time and space. I joke about it. I have an article coming out in a book very soon on this. I joke about it, but it was quite serious. We were expected to solve Einsteinian theories that he had not himself solved. How in the hell are women in the workforce under lockdown in Italy in February of 2020 supposed to work full time, take care of their children's didattica alla distanza, this home learning for online, and care for the family, etc.? Of course,
Hmm.
this was an impossibility. What we're seeing is this very strange obsession by Italian women who cherry pick their fights. I also found out last year that to get back into academia here requires a huge bureaucratic process where the government didn't even offer a reprieve of 2 years, because we were basically in and out of lockdowns of various natures for 2 years here. No, that means directly, and you know this, that the only people who could possibly do all the acrobatics necessary to get back into academia would have to be wealthy, because that's the only kind of person that can afford to take hundreds of hours to do this nonsense. And it's
Hmm.
complete nonsense, by the way. In Italy, they only consider academic CVs over the past 5 years. And this is insanity. So, what happened is we had a complete rupture of the workforce. Women were largely forced to take care of their families and sacrifice their careers, their earnings over the usually better paid man. Not always, of course. Things are changing here as well. And so we're in this insane space where on the one hand people are unwilling to discuss the actual issues pertinent to women. But Italian feminists are obsessed with the chador. And I'm thinking, and I say to them all the time, you'd rather bomb a woman in the name of their not having a chador than to just deal with the not bombing them? I mean, this is insanity. And the same thing you see about Gaza. Well, try and be a lesbian over there and
Mhm.
come back and tell us how it goes for you. And I'm thinking, Oh my God, these are people, and you can tell by their posts, they've never traveled outside of their country very likely. And if they had, it was some kind of cruise. I mean, they do not know about the world.
Yeah.
I get very frustrated by this. The fact that, as you noted, it started with lockdown, I think, where people became overnight virologists and immunologists, and social media has buttressed this kind of cocaine induced arrogance that people have online to feel like I own the room. I can talk about anything, even though I have no facts. And you've seen this. People are saying everything about Russia and the great fear that we should have because Russia is about to invade us. And you've got the likes of Callas and von der Leyen trying to pitch this in the EU, and it's not going over with the public. But still, we have no rights, and this unelected von der Leyen can have her way. Rearm Europe again. It's all related because it's all modeling itself on this kind of post 9/11 fear factor that people around the world saw George W. Bush suspend habeas corpus. They saw him break law after law, and they got out their notebooks and said, this is interesting. We can just scare the people to death, and then they'll listen to us. And that's exactly what's going on right now, not just over Ukraine, Russia, but the no platforming that goes on around these issues, especially around Gaza, Homeland Security slash ICE, arrests of protesters slash go into any kind of chat room today to discuss some of the issues around Iran. And there's a huge division if you're in the room with any children of Iranian immigrants. We've got this very bizarre arm of feminism being used to make everything right in Gaza, hence all the lies around the beheaded babies, the babies in ovens, and all of this nonsense that went on that's been fully debunked. And that still gets treaded on social media, by the way. And now again, with the women in Iran. But we know none of this is in the name of women and children. So, how do you account for feminists who are basically pro genocide and pro war? Because this is something that has greatly disturbed me over the last almost 3 years now to see.
Well, I mean, I think it's just, I guess you can say it's a degeneration of feminism. I mean, I think that in the case of all of these ideologies, they all become badges of superiority, of moral superiority. False badges, of course, but that's all. It's not about practice. It's not and also this is partly a function of the inequality of our society, and also, by the way, a function of the cultural degeneration. What you said about, Facebook and, social media generally enabling a sort of interpersonal behavior that would never be possible on a face-to-face basis is part of this. But also, like I say, the social, the economic inequality that we have, so that you have the kind of women who are making these kind of statements that are essentially siding with genocide in the name of feminism. They belong to the elite. They are either actually are or are aspiring, either members of the professional managerial class or aspiring members of the professional managerial class, and as such they claim to pronounce on everything, whether they know about it or not. And this then becomes part of the irresponsibility of the elite that I was also mentioning earlier. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is totally a disease of our times. And let me also perhaps say one other thing, which is, uh, the way in which people talk as though, if only you knew better. The important thing about about making progress is to change people's consciousness. No, it's not about changing people's consciousness. Their consciousness will change once you change their lives. That's the key. They don't realize that. So that's where the finger wagging comes in, is that, if I only wag my finger at you enough and you changed your consciousness, then you would be on the right track and we would all be making progress. No, this is not how things happen. you know For example, let me give you an example. Back in the 1990s, there was a big debate in India. In India, we have, as you know, again, you will know that we have this different religiously specific civil codes for women. So Muslim women have their own code, Hindu women have their own code, etc., etc. And there was this idea that we should have a uniform civil code. Now, of course, the Hindu right uses the idea of a uniform civil code to impose a Hindu code on everybody else, or a code that would be amenable to Hindus, requiring them to change their lives as little as possible and impose the burden of that on religious minorities. But liberal women also want to see, elite liberal feminists also want to see the imposition of a uniform civil code through legal means. And the organization that I worked for, which was the women's wing of the CPM, All India Democratic Women's Association, took a rather different stance, which I thought was much more sensible, which is to say you have to support women where they are in their struggles. If Muslim women are struggling for greater rights within the Muslim code, that's what you support. And I think that to me is a much better way of doing it, because you are part of the way in which ordinary women are transforming their lives.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. These same issues came up during the gender wars in the post 2012 era that I was fully enmeshed in. I saw women who were struggling to be heard because they said, you're representing elite women's interests. And so these feminists, of course, they're British, largely white, but they tried to get a few voices by women of color, right? But it was very clearly to me and to other women of color that this was clearly a shift to populate their front page with this veneer of multi-ethnicity representation. But even then, it mattered very little because the class issue comes up time and time again. Why not have women speaking for your organization who represent the working class? Again, we're seeing feminist organizations. I see this in New York as well, around the pussy hat formation that they had in DC. This was all done through a lot of
Mm.
academics. As an academic myself, I have no problem with academics being involved in organizing. The problem is that it became uniquely academic. And so I remember writing one of the women and asking about her position on, because she had said something that was completely, in my opinion, misogynist towards a woman who was making a criticism of gender ideology. And I got back this response calling me transphobic. So
Um,
this became the big kibosh within feminist circles. You can't talk about class unless you're on board with gender ideology. That's the left of the gender situation. And it's become a real problem because there should be a point in which people can, I guess I'm thinking of slouching towards Ayodhya,
mhm.
where you argue that culturalism and identity based movements often obscure the underlying material forces and class dynamics of capitalist development. And this is
Mm.
exactly what I was experiencing. And I kept looking over my shoulder. You'd be talking to someone on Twitter. I'm talking back in 2012, 13. And the person would say, well, you don't respect my identity. You're a racist. And I'm thinking, wait a sec. We're talking about you, a man, insisting that I call you a woman. And now suddenly that got spun. It was a free for all and anything went. So I'm wondering if maybe the problems within the West of being able to precisely home in on discussions about class and wealth, inheritance, and the geopolitical economy in general, even, has not been vastly harmed by a group on the left who want to be perceived of as radical while they're trying to shake out the bad seeds, like all these turfs and all these transphobes over there. So it seems like now I've noticed in the recent, maybe past year or two, that things are starting to calm down, but not completely, because that comes back all the time. How can we move forward if at the end of the day, there are going to be people within West leftist groups who are policing the language of women, for instance?
No, no, exactly.
I think also when you start to discuss these issues outside of the West, people don't get it. Like, I remember once my aunt in Baroda looked at me and she goes, "Who are these people you are talking to?" She just said it was the weirdest thing in the world because the whole trans agenda, even though NGOs have tried to implant this in India, and they have, it's largely by most people regarded as bizarre and anti science. So, how is it that the Marxist tradition differs in places like India? And I'm thinking of your work on the geopolitical economy specifically, and how your work might revitalize Marx's own thinking on the relations of producing nations.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that's a whole new can of worms. I mean, the where it's been such an interesting journey for me to arrive at that, because, of course, I was taught a version of Marxism, which I have now come to criticize, what we may call Western Marxism, etc. Um, and what and I've also come to criticize Marxist economics, which is also part of Western Marxism, because essentially this way of thinking about capitalism is not Marxist. It's more Schumpeterian. It thinks of capitalism as this wonderfully robust, the understanding I gave you early on in this interview about capitalism is, it comes from sources that have not, very little to do with Western Marxism and the Marxist, so-called Marxist economics. So to me, this Western Marxism, Marxist economics, completely ignores the contradictions of capitalism, imagines that capitalism will always be excellent at developing the forces of production, etc., even if it has regrettably bad distributional consequences. But in real and so, as a result of ignoring contradictions and imagining this capitalism is this amazingly expansive and strong system, they have no conception of imperialism. They attribute the prosperity of the West to the innovative capacities of capitalism, to its ability to develop the forces of production, and not to imperialism. So, what geopolitical economy does, and I love this expression Marx has, the relations of producing nations. So, first of all, it moves us away from this very cultural concept of nations, that, we are nations because, we speak different languages or eat different foods or whatever. No, it has to do with the material organization of societies. And that central to the relations between nations is their economic structure, their productive arrangements, and so on. So this is the relations of producing nations, and so basically, I have put imperialism and anti-imperialism at the core of understanding international relations. And I would say that this understanding of international relations is, to me, more important to establish today than ever before, because it not only predicted, rather than engaging in this kind of, globalization, US hegemony type of claptrap, it actually explains and predicted multipolarity, and it is also able to contain within itself a conception of how a combination of class struggles and struggles between nations is going to bring us out of capitalism and put us on the path to socialism. So, I mean, to me, yeah, it's been a lot of work, but I've really felt it has been worth it. I mean, look, capitalism is a past master at disguising class as something else, which is how, for example, capitalism has tried to govern domestically. For example, it encourages racist sentiments so that the working class will remain divided. It encourages, gender oppositions and divisions and so on, so that they can again keep people divided and so on. And internationally, historically, capitalism, instead of talking about imperialism and so on, has always engaged in the discourse of minorities. We will go to war against this country because it is oppressing minorities. We are going to liberate minorities. What they really mean is we are going to dismember this large country into smaller and more manageable bits. So across the board, capitalism has always, because the one thing that capitalism wants to avoid talking about is that it creates it is based on exploitation of the working class, exploitation of the subordinated periphery. So in that sense, yeah, totally, capitalism is and of course India is riven with this. In India we have all these clashes between ethnicities and religions and so on, when the overwhelming question is the question of economic inequality, the question of class, and so on. So, absolutely, I totally agree with you that this is what the capitalist class does, and as you say, it keeps us occupied, and also it then creates resentment because there is just so much talk about, say, women or racial minorities or whatever, sexual minorities, but nothing is actually done to redress the condition of the vast majority. Then, on the one hand, it looks as though much is being given to these groups, when in fact nothing is being given. And on the other hand, when these groups continue to protest and demand things, then they look insatiable. In Canada, you will know, for example, that there are all sorts of perfectly decent people who genuinely think that the government is giving vast quantities of money to indigenous people for nothing. Like, you see, it is so common.
Yes, the idea that everyone on this side has it easy. It doesn't matter what the side is because we see the same kind of Manichaean, very lazy analysis happening on both the left and the right. What are some of the ways out of this? Because, first of all, you've done a lot of work on neoliberalism's failures. In your recent conversations, you've described neoliberalism as a source of many of the ills of Western economies. Is neoliberalism finally coming to an end, or is it merely evolving into a new, more authoritarian form?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and I'm someone who wrote, back in 2008, I actually wrote a column in which I said, neoliberalism is dead. But actually, it didn't die. It still continued. It just changed its form. And so I kind of, and I was kind of aware that it had changed forms before. I mean, when I was writing this column as well. But somehow I thought that this crisis was so great that it would bring it crashing down. But what then happened is that essentially, basically because the left is not organized, they patched it all up, and it has continued in a slightly different form. And now what is going on is that essentially you have two, like, if you think of labor and conservative here in the UK, or republicans and democrats in the US, you basically have two parties of neoliberalism. So on the one hand, you have the Biden types, or the Starmer types, who are neoliberal in the sense that they will not tax corporations. They will they will keep corporations unregulated, blah blah, etc. So essentially they run the economy in the interest of big corporations. And then you have the Trump types, or the Farage types, who want even further deregulation and even more freedoms for big corporations and so on. So it's just a question of degree. And at one level, the Biden types, or the Democrats, or the Starmer types, what they are doing is they are essentially selling you. So this is what I wrote in my book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War. In this book, I pointed out that we are looking at the possibility of two possible forms of right wing politics. On the one hand, you have the Democrat labor types, who are basically going to keep big corporations going by, now that big corporations have suffered from a lack of a market, then the state essentially steps in as the buyer of last resort. They will contract big corporations to produce certain goods and services, which are then provided to the people for, to cheaply, or for free, or whatever, but ultimately we will pay the price as the taxpayer. So this kind of, under in COVID, you had all the vaccine stuff and all the, various medical corporations that were getting all sorts of cost plus lucrative contracts and so on, and that's one way of doing things. And on the other hand, you have this even further deregulation and so on, combined with an authoritarian politics of the sort that you witnessed, for example, in the ICE raids in the United States, or we are witnessing here, as there are more and more curbs on political protest and so on and so forth. So these are essentially, right wing and even further right wing. Those are the two types of politics that are available to us. And of course, I should add one other thing, which is that, in the Trump version, you have more and more big corporations directly taking over the management of the state. So you have all these CEOs who have suddenly become so important, as Elon Musk was, for example, with his Doge. So they are taking a more direct part. They are no longer represented in politics; they are directly in politics.
You and Michael Hudson have discussed the failed nature of the US dollar and US dollar hegemony. Why do you believe the US attempt at world dominance through the dollar was destined to fail from its inception?
Because it is a complete myth that the currency of any single country, no matter how big and powerful, can be the currency of the world. A currency needs a state to issue it. The world, there is no world state, and by the way, there will not be one as long as we have capitalism, because it is capitalism that requires this essentially requires nation states. But and it is one of the contradictions of capitalism that on the one hand it requires nation states, and on the other hand it necessarily overspills the borders, requires the state to be imperialist, and now the room for imperialism is decreasing. Anyway, to come back to your main question about so it is a myth that we have been fed this under the guise of hegemony theories and so on. But and the most important example that we are supposed to sort of compare the dollar to is sterling. But sterling could function as world money, and did function as world money in ways that are completely different from what the dollar has been doing. So first of all, sterling could function as the world's money because it was not because it was the national currency of the United Kingdom or whatever, the multinational United Kingdom, but because it was an imperial currency. Uh, so that's the first thing. And the second thing is that because it was an imperial currency, essentially it functioned by drawing surpluses, tributes, whatever you want to call it. They were called given all sorts of euphemisms, but they essentially drew surpluses from the non-settler colonies like India or Africa or the Caribbean, but chiefly India, because India. That's why India was so important. India was the jewel in the crown. Um, Drawing surpluses from these non-settler colonies and then investing them, providing sterling these surpluses provided sterling liquidity to the rest of the world, in the form of capital exports, which Britain undertook. And these capital exports did not go to the non-settler colonies. They went primarily to Europe, to the United States, and to the remaining settler colonies of the UK, which is why these parts of the world experienced their rapid industrialization in the period of sterling dominance. But the United States did not have any surpluses to export. So it has been providing the world with liquidity by running deficits. This is inherently unstable. The bigger the deficit, the less attractive your currency. And this logic brought the dollar to the point where its linked with gold had to be broken in 1971. And thereafter, the dollar has only been able to overcome this problem, the so-called Triffin dilemma. The bigger your deficits, the less attractive your currency. They have only been able to overcome this Triffin dilemma by vastly expanding pure financial activity and therefore generating a purely financial demand for the dollar. And And this kind of brings us back to the first part of our conversation, where I was emphasizing the ills of financialization, because you see, this financialization is also connected with the dollar system. So, in part, it is a natural, shall we say, symptom of the senility of capitalism. And on the other hand, it is also deeply connected with the maintaining the dollar as the world's currency. And the result has been right now. So, we are in this very contradictory position right now, where the dollar's currency in the world, which is declining, but it is prevented from declining more precipitously by the fact that there is today a bubble in every conceivable asset class that you can think of. That's why some people call it the everything bubble. So there is enormous quantities of money sloshing around looking for investment. Uh, and a lot and at the same time, margins are very thin in all these speculative trades. So you have to borrow a lot of money in order to make money on speculative trades. And so this low interest rates are therefore necessary for maintaining this bubble. And of course, the more inflation hits the Western world, and we are in the midst of the Iran war. We are just again today, we see that despite the efforts of the International Energy Authority to release a very substantial amount of oil into the market to calm world markets for oil, the oil has once again crossed $100 a barrel, and is probably headed up, because this war is certainly not going to end when Trump wants it to end. It will end when the Iranians, I think, want it to end. This inflation situation will continue, and this, if it goes high enough, then the Western monetary authorities will react in the only way that they permit themselves to react to inflation, which is by increasing interest rates. The moment they do that, there will be, once they rise sufficiently, there will be a big crash. And this will bring down the dollar system, in my view. So this is how all these dots are connected.
Yes, in fact, we've seen the dots, not only the connections between them, but the hypocrisy revealed. Because, again, in that same week where you had Maduro and Flores being kidnapped, then you had threats being made towards Cuba, the Mexican president as well, by the way. Cuba's currently being deprived of every single resource, such that the US administration is clearly trying to instigate social unrest.
Yes.
Mexico was threatened for proposing to give Cuba resources. And then you had 3 days after the kidnapping, 3 or 4 days after, you had the pirating by the US of a ship in the North Atlantic. And then 2 days after that, more chatter about the war in Iran. And my mind wonders if that wasn't a choreography, keep people
Mm.
busy. You also had the deaths at the hands of ICE happening in the States, but everyone was like busy, busy, busy on social media discussing all these issues. And the real show was Iran. They were setting up the stage for that. So the multipolarity in BRICS issue that we've been writing on for years and publishing articles seems to be a huge threat to not only this administration, but to the US dollar, to US hegemony. And the response of the US government has been to hegemonize even more. So, kidnapping a president. This was fascinating. BBC editors and journalists were sent a memo specifically stating that they could not refer to what happened as kidnapping.
Yes.
Amazing, because if that had happened to any other Western leader,
It was called extraction. Yes.
exactly, it was extraction, arrest on charges that the DOJ had to change because there was no Carta del Sol. There was no, it was all made up stuff. I mean, he had nothing to do with any of it. So having him on US territory, then the DOJ was forced to rig up a new reason for his arrest, kidnapping. And then the same thing, we have the same thing happening with Ukraine. Zelensky comes to the States every few months asking for money. We're told about the horrors while having a Nazi sit in the Canadian Parliament being honored, being given a standing ovation. It's like, what fresh hell is this? No official apology, from my memory, by the CBC about that, by any entity that misreported it, because that's okay. We can misreport that nonsense. No discussion to this day seriously by any political party in the West about Nazis in the Ukraine military. Nothing, nothing. And then, of course, the larger problem of the kind of gentle diplomacy that Boris Johnson was apparently asked to do at the behest of the US administration regarding Ukraine in the early weeks of that conflict. And Boris Johnson has come out and spilled the beans. So now we know it wasn't just chatter amongst journalists or politicians. This really happened. So the US has done everything to basically launch a war against Russia. I don't even know why we're calling it a Ukraine v. Russia war. This is the US using Ukraine to launch a war against Russia. It's a proxy war. And then Gaza, how many years of a genocide do we have to go through? The onslaught of the International Holocaust Remembrance Association instructing US and Canadian institutions to change the definition of anti Semitism such that it's no longer saying something completely racist about Jews. Now it's a criticism of the state of Israel. And it's very clearly that when you look through the rules, which, by the way, Benjamin Netanyahu breaks daily. He breaks those rules. Fascinating. So we're being given all this kind of newspeak that we have to abide by on the one hand. And on the other, there's been no truth and reconciliation committees at all that I know of. In Canada, people are doing it ad hoc, but there's no official truth and reconciliation committee about lockdown, what happened during coronavirus. So I'm thinking to your work on this subject because in your 2023 book, you argue that the pandemic didn't cause the current economic crisis, but revealed instead the decay of neoliberalism. Now, I think the pandemic was a kind of testing ground as to how far governments could go to, well, what they did here in Europe and Italy, especially forcing farmers to get electronic means of payment. No longer could you pay the farmer at the bi-weekly market in cash. It was about getting people from working under the table in part. It was also about shutting down businesses. And how many really good restaurants have been closed in Italy? You won't find that in the media. How many freelancers were left starving? You won't find that in the media. I talk to social workers here. They've had an onslaught of charity cases because of what the government did, despite the fact that Italy was probably the least economically affected because 87% of Italians own a home. Okay, it's a very high percentage. It's the highest in Western Europe. The only places that have higher home ownership are the former Yugoslav states and other Eastern European countries. What can you say about the rise of the global South amidst the rise of BRICS, the kind of cohesion that we're seeing? And it's going to increase, I think, with what the US and Israel have done in Iran. The cohesion and alliances being made between even India and Russia and China and South Africa and Brazil. You're seeing more and more countries standing up and saying, this isn't a war. This is actually terrorism. I mean, what Iranians are living right now is 9/11 daily. And Americans seem to be very unsympathetic to this.
Let me address this because it's a very interesting set of questions. So, first of all, I've always been very conditional about BRICS. So, I have read, I wrote a column back in the early 2010s, saying the BRICS are challenging Western hegemony and so on. But I pointed out that the reason they were doing so, and at that time it was true of all the BRICS countries, that the reason they are doing so is because they are somehow either rejecting or modifying or rejecting or modifying neoliberalism, or like China, they have never been under a neoliberal regime. Um, And so neoliberalism was the key. The rejection or modification, at least, of neoliberalism was the key. And at that time, you had Lula in Brazil, you had, obviously, and you had a Congress government in India. So, with its Enrega and whatnot. So, Indian economy was doing pretty well at that time. Now, however, it seems that, although I think Lula is doing what he can, particularly with the Modi government in India, India is not acting like a brick at all. Modi is running and is eager to do the bidding of the Trump administration, of Israel, etc., etc. And so, in that sense, I think that and of course, he's a complete neoliberal in the sense that he runs the Indian economy. I often like to joke that Modi has a 1 point economic program that is to do the bidding of the biggest Indian corporations, not even like, the 5 or 10 biggest. Everybody below that, even if you are still a big corporation, you get short shrift. So that's what Modi is doing, and it has been an absolute disaster for the Indian economy. So, and in fact, I recently wrote a piece on this called "How Not to Think of India as a BRICS country." Because this rhetorical uh, the rhetoric that people like Jaishankar engage in, or even Modi himself, it's a complete sham. They are not. They are actually taking India in a very problematic and dangerous direction. So now, I would say that, and even in Brazil, Lula is to some extent limited by the fact that he is not able to challenge the power of big Brazilian corporations to the extent that he needs to, if Brazil is going to do better. But anyway, the point is that, um, so what's happening now is that rather than BRICS as such, I think what's emerging is that there are some countries which, for historical reasons, have stood up to the West, and they now form what George W. Bush ages ago called the axis of evil. So that includes China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, etc. And at least at the moment, under Modi, it will not include India. So the thing is, a bit more complex than that.
You note that China developed without the benefit of imperialism. What specific lessons can other third world countries learn from China's new quality productive forces?
Well, I think that, a little while ago, last year, around this time, I wrote an article which was published late last year called How DeepSeek Upends the Silicon Valley sci-fi business model. So sci-fi, but also financial fiction, science fiction and financial fiction, the combination of the two, which is basically what has happened with this AI thing and so on. Um, so I Yeah, so to me, what's involved here is that capitalism is basically no longer capable of developing the forces of production. The forces of production are now being developed in China in a much bigger way because China has the capacity, because basically, if the development of the forces of production is to be a matter of making profits, then you are not going to get anywhere. But in the case of China, it is a matter of national development of national industries, technologies, investment in the national population. The university going population in China has expanded massively in recent decades. China is now at the top of in terms of scientific publications, in terms of patents and what have you. And if you look at this thing, which is the very interesting index that has been created by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is your classic Cold Warrior think tank. They track critical technologies, and their complaint is that since the beginning of this century, when they started tracking these technologies. Back then, China, out of some 60 odd technologies they were tracking, China was ahead in three. Today, out of some 64 technologies that they are tracking, China is ahead in 57, and the US in the rest. So this is so to me, I think that this approach that China is taking is great, and I think that there is potentially uh, if the process is well managed, I think it could yield huge dividends, not just for China, but for the rest of the world.
You framed the current global tension as a choice between BRICS G7 framework and the NATO G7 order. Is a pluripolar world actually safer or simply more prone to fragmented conflict?
Ah, very important. Remember, I said earlier that capitalism foments wars.
Mhm.
Insofar as the pluripolar world is necessarily going to have to move away from capitalism, it will indeed be a safer world, because these countries will not be home to capitalisms and their contradictions that necessarily require imperialism and competition among imperial powers and so on. So there will be less occasion for war.
In your 2023 book, where you argue that the pandemic didn't cause the current economic crisis, how do you frame then the role of COVID 19 in accelerating this shift towards multipolarity? Because some people, the pandemic people believe that this was part of a global plan by the elites. What do you see as being some of the other factors that contributed to this shift towards multipolarity?
Basically, what contributes to the shift towards multipolarity is essentially neoliberalism. I mean, think about it. It is with the neoliberal onset of the neoliberal age that you see the decline of the West. And in this context, as the West is able to give less and less, the rise of at least some countries which have managed to, develop their own technologies and create their own growth patterns and so on, they have become essentially the sites for greater amount of manufacturing, production, etc., etc. So, in a certain sense, the decline of the West, the rise of the emerging powers, they are part of the same logic, which is leading to pluripolarity.
You've written extensively on India's shift from developmental nationalism to cultural nationalism. I'm thinking, obviously, of the Hindutva and Modi and what has gone on since the riots in Gujarat, I would have to say. So, why does neoliberalism so often go hand in hand with right wing cultural grievances? And what do we do with these grievances? Where, for instance, as you well know, there are grievances in India that actually resemble some of what was happening in Bangladesh 18 months ago, where you have many finishing university and they're not very thrilled with the way that jobs are allotted. So, how do we balance the grievances from the right with the grievances from the left in the case of India and Hindutva?
Essentially, it's very simple. Neoliberalism, like I said, engages in a miserly and punitive politics vis-a-vis working people, right? So it has nothing to give working people. So nothing material to give working people. So the only thing it can offer them is the offer some of them, that is to say, those of them who can be considered at least notionally members of a of the ruling group. So whether you are white in Western countries or upper caste or in India or what have you, they give them the psychological satisfaction of being part of this group. And then, of course, in return for this, turn members of this group into shock troops of people who will be then willing to engage in retail violence against members of the oppressed groups. So this is very functional because it serves so they don't miss they don't object to the miserliness of neoliberalism, because they are getting some kind of psychological compensation, and they contribute to the punitiveness of neoliberalism by being the shock troops that will inflict violence in the case of India against Muslims and other religious minorities and so on.